On Christmas Day, while the world was wrapped in lights, laughter, and warmth, Diep felt a quiet ache in her heart. Behind James' gentle smile, she sensed a secret he was hiding, pain he chose to carry alone so she wouldn't have to share the burden. As snow fell softly outside and the bells rang in the distance, Diep realized that love isn't only about joy. Sometimes it's about recognizing the silent suffering of the one you cherish most. Christmas arrived quietly that year, slipping into the small town like a familiar melody, soft, nostalgic, and faintly sad. The morning air carried the scent of cold earth and distant pine, and from somewhere far away, church bells echoed, reminding people of warmth, forgiveness, and family. Diep stood by the window of her modest home, watching thin lines of sunlight stretch across the yard. In her hands was a chipped ceramic mug, still warm, yet her fingers felt cold. Christmas was supposed to feel full, but her heart sensed an emptiness she could not ignore. James had not come home the night before. He had said he was busy, his voice steady but unusually distant, as if every word had been carefully measured. Diep knew that tone too well. It was the sound of someone pretending to be strong when they were already breaking. She did not ask more questions. Love, she had learned, sometimes meant listening to what was not said. Outside, children laughed as they ran past with cheap plastic ornaments and handmade paper stars. Their joy felt innocent, almost fragile, like something that could shatter if touched too roughly. Diep smiled faintly, yet her thoughts drifted back to James, where he was, whether he had eaten, whether he was staring at the same winter sky, pretending he was fine. She remembered how James used to love Christmas, not for the gifts or decorations, but for the rare moments of stillness it brought. On Christmas, he once told her, people are kinder. Even pain rests for a while. But this year, pain had not rested. It followed him like a shadow he refused to turn toward. Diep moved slowly around the house, preparing a simple meal. Each sound, the knife touching the cutting board, the rice boiling gently, felt louder than usual. She imagined James sitting alone somewhere, perhaps in that old, forgotten house near the community hall, carrying burdens he believed no one should share. The thought tightened her chest. She wanted to call him. Her fingers hovered over her phone, then stopped. If James was hiding something, it was not because he did not trust her. It was because he thought love should not be burdened with pain. And that, Diep realized, was the quiet cruelty of his kindness. As the afternoon light faded, Diep wrapped herself in a thin sweater and stepped outside. Christmas lights flickered on, one by one, like small promises in the dark. Somewhere in that darkness, James was suffering alone. And on this Christmas Day, Diep knew, truly knew, that love would not let her stay where she was.
The afternoon grew colder as Christmas drifted toward evening, and the sky slowly turned the color of old memories, pale gray mixed with a faint blush of fading light. Diep walked along the narrow road leading out of the village, her steps unhurried but resolute. Each breath formed a small cloud before her face, as if even the air was trying to speak what she already knew. James was nearby. She could feel it in the quiet heaviness pressing against her chest. The old house stood at the edge of the field, half hidden behind wild grass and bare trees. It had once belonged to a caretaker, long gone, leaving behind cracked walls and a roof that groaned with every change in the weather. Diep stopped a few steps away. A dim light glowed inside, trembling like a tired heartbeat. For a moment she hesitated. Some truths, once seen, could never be unseen. She knocked softly. No answer. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until the door finally opened. James stood there, his face thinner, his eyes darker than she remembered. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. That smile hurt her more than silence ever could. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly, stepping aside. "I know," Diep replied, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "That's why I did."
Inside, the house was cold and sparsely furnished. A small table, an old chair, and scattered documents lay across the floor like pieces of a life falling apart. James turned away, pretending to arrange papers that no longer needed arranging. Diep watched him, noticing how his shoulders slumped when he thought she wasn't looking. Christmas music drifted faintly from a distant radio outside, cheerful and out of place. Diep sat down slowly, letting the silence speak for both of them. Finally, she broke it, not with questions, but with truth. "You're tired," she said, "and you're afraid." James laughed softly, a hollow sound. "Afraid of what? I've handled worse." Diep shook her head. "No, afraid of letting someone carry this with you." Her words landed gently, yet they shook him. He closed his eyes, as if holding back something heavy. In that moment, Diep understood. James was not hiding pain because he was weak. He was hiding it because he believed love meant endurance, not sharing. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, quiet, and forgiving. Inside that broken house, Christmas did not arrive with joy or gifts. It arrived with truth, waiting patiently between two people who were finally brave enough to face it together. Night fell quietly, the kind of night that seemed to tiptoe into the world, careful not to disturb broken thoughts or fragile hearts. The small house grew dimmer as the light outside faded, leaving only a single bulb flickering above them. Shadows stretched along the walls, turning ordinary objects into reminders of things left unfinished. Diep wrapped her coat tighter around herself, not because of the cold, but because of the heaviness settling between them. James finally sat down across from her. For the first time that day, he did not pretend to be busy. His hands rested on his knees, still, uncertain, hands that had built companies, signed contracts, carried responsibility, yet now trembled slightly in the quiet. Diep noticed everything. Love, she realized, was often hidden in these silent details. "I didn't want you to see me like this," James said at last. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the room. "Everyone expects me to be fine, strong, untouched." Diep looked at him, her eyes soft but unyielding. "That's the part that scares me," she answered. "Not your weakness, your loneliness." His breath caught. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. James turned his face away, staring at the wall as if it held answers he had missed all his life. Slowly, the story began to unfold. Missed phone calls, family conflicts buried under pride, nights spent awake pretending work was more important than rest, more important than home. Each sentence fell like a confession, uneven and raw. Outside, laughter echoed faintly from somewhere in the village, a family celebrating, a child calling for warmth. The sounds slipped through the cracks of the old house, weaving reality into memory. Diep listened, not interrupting, letting his words find their own rhythm, rising when anger surfaced, falling when regret took over. "There are days," James admitted, "when I don't know who I'm doing all this for." Diep stood and moved closer, her steps slow, deliberate. She did not touch him right away. Instead, she knelt slightly so their eyes met. "Then stop doing it alone," she said. "Life isn't meant to be survived in silence." Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of every ordinary day they had shared. Meals eaten together, laughter over small mistakes, the comfort of simply being present. James's eyes filled, though no tears fell. Strength, Diep realized, was not the absence of pain, but the courage to let someone witness it. The bulb flickered again, then steadied. In that fragile light, something shifted. Not everything was fixed, nothing was magically healed, but for the first time in a long while, James was no longer alone with his suffering, and that quiet change felt like the beginning of something real. Christmas morning arrived without announcement, as if it too was unsure whether it was welcome. Pale light slipped through the window, touching the floor gently, awakening the room little by little. Diep opened her eyes to the quiet sound of breathing nearby. James was still there. He had not disappeared into work, into silence, or into the excuses he often used to protect himself. For once, he stayed. Outside, the village stirred awake. A rooster crowed. Footsteps crunched on frosty ground. Life, simple and persistent, went on. Diep watched James sleep for a moment, noticing how different he looked without the armor of control. In sleep, he was just a man, tired, human, vulnerable, and something in her chest tightened, not with worry, but with understanding. When James woke, he did not rush to stand. He sat there, rubbing his eyes, as if afraid that movement might break the fragile peace they had found. "I used to think holidays were only for people who had nothing to run from," he said quietly. "Now I think they're for people who are brave enough to stop." Diep smiled, a small smile, but real. She poured 2 cups of warm tea, the steam rising like unspoken promises. Stopping doesn't mean giving up. It means choosing what truly matters. They ate a modest breakfast together. Bread, tea, and silence that no longer felt heavy. The world did not change outside. Problems waited patiently. Responsibilities still existed. But inside that small house, something had softened. The sharp edges of pain had not vanished, yet they no longer cut as deeply. Later, as church bells echoed faintly in the distance, James stood by the door. For a brief moment, old habits tugged at him, the instinct to leave, to disappear, to handle everything alone. He paused, then turned back to Diep. "I don't know how to fix everything," he admitted, "but I don't want to hide anymore." That was his promise. Not grand, not dramatic, just honest. Diep reached for his hand. "Life isn't fixed in one day," she said. "It's chosen every day." As they stepped outside together, the cold air bit at their skin, sharp and alive. Children's laughter rang somewhere nearby, and a simple Christmas song drifted through the morning. In that sound, there was no perfection, only warmth, imperfection, and hope. And perhaps that was the true gift of Christmas. Not miracles, not answers, but the courage to face life side by side, even when the road ahead remained uncertain. One of the most meaningful lessons in life is learning that strength does not always come from standing alone. Many people grow up believing that being strong means hiding pain, solving problems silently, and never depending on others. Society often praises independence and endurance, yet quietly ignores the cost of loneliness. Over time, this belief can turn into a heavy burden, teaching people to run from their emotions instead of facing them. Life, however, has a way of slowing us down. Through moments of warmth, loss, or unexpected kindness, we begin to realize that true courage lies in honesty. It takes bravery to admit exhaustion, to say, "I am not okay," and to allow someone else to stand beside us. Sharing pain does not make it weaker, it makes it lighter. When we open our hearts, even slightly, we create space for healing. Another important lesson is that love is not proven through grand gestures, but through presence, staying when it is uncomfortable, listening without trying to fix everything, and choosing patience over escape are quiet forms of love that matter the most. In everyday life, these moments appear simple, waiting together, sharing a meal, or offering a gentle word, but they hold deep emotional power. They remind us that connection is built in ordinary moments, not perfect ones.
Life also teaches us that problems do not disappear just because we face them. Responsibilities remain, mistakes cannot be undone, and pain does not vanish overnight. However, facing life together changes how heavy those challenges feel. When we stop running and start choosing what truly matters, we discover that peace does not come from control, but from acceptance. In the end, the lesson is clear. Being strong does not mean walking alone. It means having the courage to stay, to face life honestly, and to choose connection over fear. That choice, made again and again in small ways, is what truly transforms us.